Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join you in the discussion. There has been a long-standing desire to close what is seen as a gap between research and policy. Policymakers often complain that academics are merely interested in blue skies research with no immediate relevance to policy. Academics, on the other hand, are concerned with what Carol Weiss called the problem of little effects, referring to a large amount of policy-related research which is not used in policy. And we had so many examples from Diane this morning. Both communities, however, acknowledge the need for better communication and dialogue. In Britain, the need to bridge the gap found a new salience under the New Labour, and after the publication of a white paper on modernising government, which marked the upsurge in what is called evidence-based policy. With that in mind, in 2003, I was commissioned to set up and lead a planning research network for the UK government. The network consisted of 30 senior academics from across the country. This diagram that you can see here is how I perceive the role of the network, sitting sort of centrally between two neatly defined communities, policy makers on the one hand and researchers on the other hand, and then seamlessly transferring policy concerns into research agenda and research findings into policy agenda. Well, it didn't take me very long to realize that the real world of policy, in the real world, the interface between policy and research doesn't really look like this seamless, almost conveyor belt. It soon became clear that in the real world, what underpinned the evidence-based policy mantra was a set of utilitarian and instrumental assumptions which portrayed the relationship between policy and research as a linear, unproblematic process in which either research leads policy and therefore the experts are on top, or research follows policy and hence experts are on tap. Given the pace of policy cycle, in practice, it was the latter which became the dominant expectations from our network. So the emphasis was always on speed, on the need for research to be timely, digestible, and available on demand. The emphasis was on not just useful, but immediately usable research. There was little appetite for an alternative way of framing the policy research interface, which can be called the Enlightenment model. Here, rather than research serving public policy agenda directly, its benefits are indirect and sometimes takes longer to be realized. The emphasis here in this model is not necessarily on producing direct input into policy, but on illuminating the landscape within which policy decisions are made. The emphasis is on providing a deeper understanding of the conditions within which different policy interventions might be effective. Under the Enlightenment model, a broader view of policy research interaction is advocated, which puts the emphasis on evidence-informed rather than evidence-based policy. But much of the current drive behind the interest in evidence-based policy is rooted in the linear and utilitarian view, and is underpinned by a number of misconceptions, such as the fact that policy making is a rational process, that knowledge can only be generated through positive science, that experts are apolitical and value-free and they know best. methods of engaging with policy making clearly show the mismatch between notions of how policy process should work and its actual messy, uncertain, and essentially political realities. It confirmed that policymaking is often a matter of bricolage rather than consistent principles, that most policies are compromise, hit-and-miss affairs. I realized that there is an element of truth in what John Maynard Keynes told us some years ago, that there is nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, because it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. It reminds me of Diane's talking about data makes people confused. This also shows that the context within which the interface between research and policy is played out is an important factor in how research is used in decision-making. Practical, institutional, and political factors can easily lead to the problem of little effect, with a great deal of research commissioned by government sitting on the shelf gathering dust, as admitted in this quote that I've put there by the Cabinet Office itself. But as researchers, we need to acknowledge that in the real world of policy making, research is not the only contender for influencing policy. There are other powerful competitors, such as ideology, interest, institutional norms and practices, just to mention a few. As regards ideology, we know that basic values and underlying belief systems often shape and sometimes determine policy outcome in such a way that no amount of valid research can change it, at least not in the short term. And this again echoes some of the points that were raised this morning. There is also the influence of institutional traditions, cultures, and also capacity to absorb, comprehend, and verify multiple research claims. Often the demand for quick fixes discourages the commissioning or the use of long-term strategic research. Researchers are sometimes expected to come up with the right answers for the wrong questions. There is also policymakers' inability or lack of time to read long written reports. For example, and I suppose Diane has more experience of that, it's been suggested that in the US Congress, research that arrives in large written documents doesn't have much of a chance to be noticed. There is also the more extreme cases when organizations' self-interest and expediency undermine the use of research altogether. In these circumstances, research agenda is politically driven to establish a particular point of view and justify a particular policy direction, often through a process of cherry-picking, with some evidence is used or amplified, while others are disregarded or marginalized. So, contrary to the instrumental view of policy research interface, there is more to policy and practice than the disinterested pursuit of truth and wisdom. It takes more than knowledge and evidence to make policy. Narrow instrumentalism not only curtails imagination and creativity, it is also based on fragile assumptions about the interface between policy and research. So to just finish, it's much more helpful, it seems to me, if we think less in terms of evidence-based policy and more in terms of evidence-informed society by engaging in public discourse, which was again again mentioned this morning. Thank you.